Yes.
Okay, welcome all. Given that many of you are new here, I suppose let me just briefly summarize the idea of this whole series of debates in interdisciplinarity. From our point of view, that is from the point of view of the Center of Excellence in the Philosophy of Social Sciences, it's a kind of exercise in interventionist method in an attempt to acquire information about scientific practices. And part of these practices, maybe an increasing part of these practices, are interdisciplinary in nature. So we seek to provoke these debates, and once the heat is on, we enter and try to reconcile the parties that are fighting with one another. Maybe this is something that you will be witnessing later today. And from the point of view of the speakers themselves, they are representing at least two disciplinary backgrounds. The idea is to provide a platform, a forum for learning about one another, and thereby to learn about oneself, about one's own disciplinary conventions, and maybe the limits of those conventions, and so forth. So this is a learning opportunity for the speakers from the different scientific disciplines. And today, as you know, the speakers come from two disciplines, economics and ecology. Mikko Mönkkönen from the University of Jyväskylä, professor of applied ecology, and Olli Tahvonen, professor of forest economics and policy from this university. And as you know, there has been an interesting situation, tensions and what have you between these two disciplines, and they do have those tensions do have a public dimension to them, because ecological concerns are very much public concerns, and one might expect these academic disciplines to play a role in dealing with these public concerns. So just very briefly, thinking of interdisciplinarity and its goals, we may have a situation when we have two or more scientific or academic disciplines dealing with one another, encountering one another, maybe having a debate between one another or collaborating with one another, whatever the situation may be. And then the idea is that whatever worth these interdisciplinary encounters of whatever kind may have is dependent on the goals that have been set, that should be served and pursued. And there might be epistemic goals such as explanatory power, I mean better explanation for the phenomena you want to better understand. One discipline, for instance, might be too narrow, not fully equipped for providing those explanations, so some help from neighboring disciplines might be needed, etc. Or one discipline might be on the wrong track entirely, and therefore some criticism from a neighboring discipline is due. Things like that. Reliability of the results, I mean maybe the body of data or evidence that typically is collected within one discipline is incomplete, imperfect, prone to error and so forth, and therefore some support from neighboring discipline is welcome, things like that. So those are the epistemic goals that might be served by interdisciplinary encounters. Then there are practical goals that also can be served, and policy effectiveness, of course, is one of those, and I think it plays a prominent role in today's debate, and whenever the environmental disciplines are involved. And typically, or at least sometimes, when these policy concerns, practical goals are dealt with, not only is there an expectation of a contribution from academic disciplines in place, but also some sort of non-academic input to the process. And this might come from policymakers, NGOs, businesses, indigenous groups, and what have you. Resource managers in the case of today's topic, and so forth. Earlier we had last spring, I think we had a session on interfield comparison regarding these policy engagements, and the speakers talked about these two international organizations that sort of mediate between academic information, academic investigations, and policy implementations, the IPCC and IPBES, that actually follow different strategies regarding the policy engagement of academic inquiry. So this is linked to the previous session in that manner. Now, today's setup, ecology versus or plus economics, features several key concepts and key issues such as that of scale. I mean, these two disciplines seem to be dealing with their target domains at different scales. Smaller scale in case of ecology, larger scale in the case of economics, and that creates tensions or problems or frictions of communication between them, difficulties of mutual understanding and things of that kind. Value. I mean, how does one measure the value of nature or whatever there is out there, and how to measure that value? This is a big issue between these two and within these two. Substitutability, a related issue. The very concept of ecosystem service. This is hard. I find it a fascinating concept, and I wonder, it has been widely adopted in policy circles, in academic inquiry, and all that, and there is fairly little questioning of it, other than in broader scale of social sciences. There are quite a few circles in social sciences who regard this as a kind of dubious neoliberal concept, surrender to the market regime and all that. While others say it's okay, it's just okay. It provides a bridge between different parties in the overall conversation, and also provides facilitates communication between ecology and economics and all that. I'm not sure whether we will learn more about this later today. This might be, by the way, a nice topic for some future session, far more focused and very hot. And everything relates to the role of the market. I mean, what exactly is the role of the market institution, the market mechanism, and all that in dealing with ecological issues. Now, of course, there is the traditional charge, accusation, from coming from ecologists and ecological economists, namely that conventional economics, or what's often called mainstream economics, I'm not sure what exactly that is, that economics misses important facts about both nature and society, and thus about the conditions of good policy. So standard economics is not sufficiently interdisciplinary in this sense. Other disciplines are needed to fill in the gaps, etc., to provide a more complete picture. But today we are going to hear about another charge from Olli Tahvonen, namely that ecology itself is not sufficiently interdisciplinary, and therefore it lacks in policy relevance. This is going to be very, very interesting. So the questions today, as already communicated in our announcement, include the following. What are the similarities between economics and ecology? What are the relevant differences between them? What's a traditional critique of economics by ecologists? Do ecology textbooks misrepresent economics? Olli Tahvonen is going to say yes. I'm not sure what Mönkkönen is going to say. Might ecology itself be deficient in ignoring economic considerations? Again, I think Olli is inclined towards a positive answer. How can ecology and economics be brought in closer collaboration with one another? Maybe we will have this nice happy end, but I don't know yet. We'll see. So, Mikko Mönkkönen will start. Go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. My name is Mikko Mönkkönen. I come from University of Jyväskylä, where I'm professor in applied ecology. For the past 15 years or so, I've been interacting and doing collaboration with economists, and particularly environmental economists. So I couldn't resist the invitation by Uskali when he invited me over to this discussion. I think this is hopefully very useful and fruitful event. So I will first provide, from my point of view, some insights. First of all, I will define what ecology is, and then also trying to define what economics is. And then, based on my own research, I will give an example showing a blind spot in the current way economics, natural resource economics, put value on things. And I argue that the current economics approach is too narrow to capture the full value of ecosystems and ecological attributes out there in the nature. And then I will also touch upon this concept of ecosystem services and how we put value on ecosystem services, and why economic analysis alone is not sufficient in solving environmental problems and the question of sustainable use of natural resources, including ecosystem services, including natural resources. And finally, I will touch upon the concept called resilience, which I think is a future challenge for ecological economics to tackle with. So, definitions. When we first start dealing with ecology, it's a kind of a traditionally, if you take a textbook of ecology, the definition is that it's a scientific research on how individuals, populations, and their communities interact with their environment. But if you look at the original definition of ecology by Ernst Haeckel, a German zoologist from 1870s, he said that he defined, this is the first definition of what ecology as science is. It's a body of knowledge concerning the economy of nature. So investigation of the total relations of the animals. Well, he was zoologist, that's why he was pointing out the animals, but basically organisms, to its inorganic and to organic environment. And it derives from Greek words oikos, which means house or dwelling or habitation. So it's a place where organisms live. And logia is a study of house or dwellings or habitation. So right from the beginning, ecology is a kind of an economic research on how organisms are related to their environment. And also derived from this Greek words or the etymology of the word ecology, it is obvious that ecology is, at least to some extent, tied to very place where ecological processes happen. That's why it tended to be small scale in the beginning. It's the environment where organisms live. Whereas economics, it's a science that addresses how to allocate scarce resources among alternative competing ends in market systems. So, for example, how individuals and societies relate themselves to resources they use, sharing, refining, and trade. So, in a way, we can see from those definitions that economics is human ecology, how humans relate themselves to their abiotic and biotic environment. Whereas, as we can see, we saw already in Haeckel's original definition, ecology is the economics of nature. So I see that there are lots of things in common between these two areas of research. Right from the beginning, I think the logic behind these two approaches and two areas in science are pretty similar. But there are differences, and particularly differences in the regimes that they are dealing with. And that's one thing that I'm going to discuss next. I promised to give you an example from my own study. And in this particular project, we address questions like how to maintain economically and ecologically sustainable forestry at the landscape scale and in the long run. So large-scale, long-term, sustainable use of our forest resources. More specific questions in this particular case include like, what is the optimal combination of management that provides maximum amount of timber and is able to maintain, for example, maximum amount of timber and at the same time able to maintain biodiversity out there in the forests. And in this case study, our study area is in central Finland. It's a large landscape consisting of 30,000 individual forest stands that we have been simulating 50 years into the future with 7 alternative management regimes. Those management regimes include management types like the recommended intensive forest practice in Finland, including clear cutting, planting trees, thinning, and so forth. Kind of a traditional business as usual forestry, Finnish forestry. That's the one end, opposite end of the continuum. On the opposite end is total set aside. And 5 different regimes in between, varying from very intensive to no forestry at all. So you can just imagine how large is the number of combinations that one can get. You have 30,000 forest stands 50 years in the future with 7 alternative options. So we basically know 7 alternative future trajectories for each of the forest stands.
So,
yeah.
Can you just define forest stand?
Forest stand is usually, in this particular case, it's like 1 to 2 hectares of forest, which is more or less.
So it's the 45.
Yeah. More or less homogeneous stand of trees. Okay, this is one example and one result from our research. Typically, the relationship between the amount of money you can get out of the forest within the 50 years time window is in trade-off between biodiversity. Here we measured biodiversity as habitat availability for species living in forests. So the more you reap money out of the forest, the less there tends to be habitats available for the species living in forests. The good thing is that the trade-off is not linear. So you can increase the habitat availability of species with fairly little cost. But in this particular case, there's one important point in space and time. And that dot, which is the recommended management. If all the forest stands in the landscape are managed according to the recommended management regime, meaning this business as usual scenario, we end up being in that particular spot in this area. So it is a little bit below what is optimal. This curve represents what is the optimal solution. You can't get higher than that curve, but obviously most of the practical or the current solutions are below the optimal curve. That's the absolute maximum level you can get. So this point refers to amount of money and amount of habitat if all stands are managed according to recommended management targets. And we can calculate that this management using recommended forest management results in approximately 10 million euro loss in terms of money, or 5% of the total net present value in monetary terms. But in ecological terms, it results in much higher loss of welfare if we include biodiversity as a part of welfare. So depending on species, current recommended management results into 30 to almost 300% loss of habitat. It means that actually with careful enough landscape level forestry planning, we are able to increase habitat availability quite much even without any additional costs. That's the part. And my question here is that why society is willing to pay this high ecological policy cost? This economic policy cost is fairly small compared to ecological policy cost. So the question is why society is willing to do this. Why do we have this high ecological policy cost? And I think the reason lies in current way how forest economics is applied and done. We are dealing with multiple use landscape or multi-objective landscapes. And in this case, multi-objective landscapes means that at the same time the landscape, in this case it's forest. Forest landscape is expected to provide good and benefits for the society, at the same time maintain biodiversity and related ecosystem functions and services. And these three things or requirements are related to each other, so that the way we keep the goods and benefits from the landscape and the amount of goods and benefits that we reap from the landscape has a direct effect what is the current state of biodiversity in the landscape. And we know from ecological studies that biodiversity and ecosystem service functioning and services are related. Because biodiversity species and their populations and communities, they are the structure on which ecosystem function. And ecosystem functioning is the basis for ecosystem services. So, and ecosystem services finally then create or produce goods and benefits from the human society. I will not go into details of these 6 facts about biodiversity with respect to ecosystem functioning. I just refer to this Cardinals et al. Paper in Nature last year, saying basically that we know quite much about what is the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. For example, we know that biodiversity loss reduces ecosystem functions. We know that biodiversity increases the stability of ecosystem functions through time. We know that the more diverse communities are more productive and so forth. These are hard facts that ecological research has been able to provide. Let's go back to this concept of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are benefits that human societies get from the functioning of the ecosystems. They are here in the middle. And we know that ecosystem functions are based on, ecosystem services are based on ecosystem functioning. And this ecosystem processes, this ecosystem functioning is based on biodiversity. That's already what we know. And how these ecosystem services are then translated into goods and benefits for the society. That's what economics is all about. Actually, current economics to some extent is able to take into account ecosystem services. Traditionally, economics only treated ecosystem services as an input. But lately, there has been so-called total economic value research trying to take into account also ecosystem services part. But ecology, that's a science as Haeckel defined. It's a total economics of nature, including the ecosystem structure, functioning, and the consequence ecosystem services. And it also includes the feedback loop from human actions back to ecosystems and their processes. So ecology, right, is essentially a holistic science able to deal with interactions between natural ecosystem and human actions. Then I have listed a couple of things. This is an exhaustive list, but not exhausting, I hope. Just few items to show why I think, or why many of people, researchers dealing with natural resource economics tend to think that economic analysis alone cannot be the answer. First of all, if we only look at economic value, it is evident that current economic value depends mainly on certain functional species or species group. And if we only look at what is the current value that we can right now get or read from the ecosystems, we end up losing a lot of species, because why to have more species than just those few that contribute to human benefit? So mere economic valuation of ecosystem services and goods and benefits that we reap leads to loss of biodiversity. Ecosystems also behave unpredictably and with time lags. And if we only look at current value of ecosystems and their services, there's a danger that that loss of species and resilience, which is the long-term potential of the ecosystems to process and provide this benefit, will go unnoticed. Because some species can be lost without no changes in ecosystem services. And that's why economic value does not reflect ecosystems' ability to maintain future provisioning of services. It is because economic analysis doesn't take into account the underlying processes of functioning ecosystems. It only deals with the ecosystem service part and the goods and benefits, direct goods and benefits from the ecosystem, but not the essential processes that lie behind these goods and benefits. Third, values based on human preferences. They tend to reflect policies, subsidies, all sorts of operations of the societies. And thus, they indicate the true value for the society only by chance. That's one of the criticisms that have been raised. So, to summarize, economic analysis is the output, economic value is the output of ecosystems at one point in time and space. It is not the state or the long-term capacity of the ecosystems to provide these services. It doesn't take into account, it is kind of applied to ecosystem stability or resistance, meaning what is the capacity of the ecosystems to provide a stable flow of ecosystem services in time, and how much they are able to resist human disturbance. It is also applied with respect to ecosystem resilience, which is the long-term capacity of the ecosystem to provide these services and benefits. And it is, to some extent at least applied to intergenerational sustainability, meaning the future generations' ability to get benefits and services from the ecosystem. So in other words, economic analysis does not alone help in solving how to manage sustainable use of ecosystems. Whereas ecological analysis, as we already saw, it's non-anthropogenic. It deals with natural capital. It deals with the ecosystem structures, the biodiversity part of the ecosystems. That's built in the ecological analysis. So natural capital, natural stock is built in ecological theories. Ecology directly considers complexity, structure, stability, resilience. Those are the key concepts of ecological analysis and theory, as well as flow of natural capital in space and time. We have ecological research such as landscape ecology or macroecology that directly deals with large-scale, long-term aspects of ecosystems. And sustainability is a core concept in ecological analysis and research. That's why I think ecological value is more comprehensive than economic value when we deal with, for example, ecosystem services and value of ecosystems. Final words about resilience and sustainability. And as I said in the beginning, this is kind of a challenge for future research in environmental economics. Resilience is ecosystems' ability to maintain the provisioning of ecosystem services into the future. I pose a question. If we are able to maintain long-term intergenerational resilience, isn't it more valuable from sustainability point of view than large economic benefits right now? In other words, should we give more or at least equal emphasis on future than present value? And this is in sharp contrast with current economic thinking, which tends to put more emphasis on current values that you can read from the ecosystems. You know this discounting of values. The further away in future the values are, the less is the amount because of discount. But my question is, shouldn't it be the other way around when we talk about environmental benefits and environmental values? Thank you.
Okay, that's the title. My role is to present the view, the economic point of view, or at least my personal point of view. Before I start, I must give a warning. When you follow the presentation and when you look at the slides, you may see some frightening trolls in the slides. The first frightening troll is scientific imperialism troll. The next one is neoclassical economics troll. It's horrible. The third one is sociobiology troll. Disgusting. So I have made a lot of effort to minimize their role, but one never knows. Sometimes they just pop up without any warning. Okay. So, these are not those trolls. So if we consider these two disciplines, this is perhaps the most well-known example that these disciplines, they have close connections. Thomas Malthus, he borrowed some ideas from nature. He wrote his essay on population. Darwin read the essay and he obtained some useful ideas when he was developing his own theory of natural selection. Later, some very famous economists, they have noted that there is close connection between economic and biological systems. One interesting detail is that if you open present-day ecological textbook, it's often mentioned that so-called exponential and density-dependent growth models originate from Malthus. So if this is true, then we can argue that limits to growth were discovered in economics and later understood in ecology as well, not the other way around. It's quite interesting. Okay, if we consider more contemporary science, we can observe that in economics we have a theory of rational choice, consumer utility maximization. In ecology or ecologists, they have optimal operating behavior of animals and fitness maximization, not utility maximization. In economics, we have model for production and profit maximizing firm, and ecologists use quite similar model when they explain resource allocation and optimization for plants. Then in economics we have optimal investments, optimal economic growth, concepts like interest rate, discounting and so on. And in ecology there are models for optimal life history strategies, reproduction values and so on. And even discounting can be found from ecological models. Then game theory, it was developed originally by economists and mathematicians, but quite quickly it was noticed that it's very useful framework in ecology as well. And ecologists, they developed evolutionary game theory, and that's nowadays used by economists as well. So quite nice and interesting interaction. So one interesting issue is so-called tragedy of the commons idea. In economics, we study strategy of the commons within humans. So, and in ecology, tragedy of the commons is studied within non-humans. So, however, the concepts are quite similar. So, both sciences use prisoner's dilemma, that's game theory, concepts like cheating, punishment. In economics, we use the concept externalities, common property houses, public goods, and in ecology, also cheating, punishment, and social goods. Quite similar concepts. In economics, examples of tragedy of the commons, they include enclosure, both environmental problems, congestion, and in ecology, resource competition. That is very similar problem we are studying in economics. Parent, offspring, conflicts and so on. So here we see some examples. This is common property or tragedy of the commons. We study in economics. Production activities may overexploit atmosphere. And in ecology, virus may overexploit host bacteria. So very similar situation. And solutions. In economics, the solution for this problem include taxes, market for permits, social pressure, punishment, and also within non-humans, punishment is one possibility to solve such a tragedy of the commons. It's quite amazing that also non-humans can in some cases solve the problem using quite similar ideas than we try to use in economics. Next, if we go a little bit closer to natural resource management, we can find this type of similarity. In economics, we study fisherman fish open access dynamics. So this is level of fish population, this is number of fishermen. In ecology, one very famous model is predator-prey dynamics, a model for predator-prey dynamics. This is limbs and hair dynamics over time. And if we depict or describe these dynamics in this similar state space where we have here prey and here predator, both models predict such a counterclockwise spiral. And if we consider the mathematical models, they look almost the same. Okay, when we come even more closer to the question how natural resources should be utilized, and we start to consider normative questions. Similar questions Mikko was discussing Then I feel that the similarities between ecology and economics more or less disappear. And why is that? So if we consider the basic ecological model in the field of fisheries, ecologists they use dynamic pool fishery model. So here is the biological population, it's fish population. There's recruitment, growth of individuals, aging, mortality and so on, connection with other populations, there may be spatial structure, environmental variables that partly determine the development of this population. There are mortality by predators, explained for example by this optimal foraging theory. And then mortality by humans, and humans they just represent another predator. And typically the human activity is specified by using the maximum sustainable yield objective or some variant. Now if we consider the economic model, we have fisherman or fishing firm, and the objective is the maximization of present value profit. We have some market structure, demand, and some other investment possibilities. The firm is using factors of production, labor, man-made capital, and so on. This is the natural resource. In typical economic models, it's specified in a way that, in a sense, the model comes from ecology, this dynamic biomass model, or it may come from Thomas Malthus. Depends how one would like to see it. But this is very simple description. It's almost like a bank account. And then there are other harvesters, institutional setup, open access, sole owner, perhaps government control, perhaps there is a common property situation. So these two views are quite different. One can say that economics seems to oversimplify ecology, and ecology perhaps oversimplifies economy. So there is not anymore such an interesting connection. But we can, in a sense, quite easily correct the situation. We just take economics from economics and ecology from ecology. Then we have interesting interdisciplinary setup. So we have the economic description of fisherman or fishing firm, and we have the biological or ecological description for the population that is harvested. Okay, there are some pros when we consider this interdisciplinary setup. First one is that this gives very reasonable picture on resource use. It's theoretically much more interesting than those earlier views I showed you. And another interesting feature is that very similar theoretical structure and mathematical methods, they can be used for various resources, for example fish, trees, game and so on, because we have now much more general biological description of the population we are harvesting. Similar type of models are used by ecologists for very different type of populations. Then it's possible to use existing ecological data, because these are the concepts ecologists are nowadays using, and that's in a sense the structure of the data in their model. So when we use this description, we can use reasonable empirical ecological data and economic analysis. Then one point we have noted many times in forest studies is that economic optimization may reveal inconsistencies in ecological studies. It's a very powerful way to study how mathematical optimization is a very powerful way to study how different type of dynamic models work. And many times we have found problems in ecological models, and it has been useful for ecologists as well. Then the fifth, economic models and results, they become much more understandable and practically relevant. It's quite interesting. We make the model much more complicated, but from the point of view of for example, decision makers, the results become much more easier to understand. Much easier to understand. Okay, but there are some problems. First is of course that models, they become much more complex. So one methodological idea in economics has been that models need not be realistic. So here we keep up that idea. It's very, in this context, it's very interesting to use very realistic models. The results are much interesting, and they are easier to understand and much more reliable. So it's, but however, it's also possible to study simple models using analytical methods. But because of day computers and good data, it's possible to study very complex models in this setup. Then economists, they sometimes argue that this framework does not represent economics at all. They may argue that this does not change anything that is economically essential. So these are directly referring comments I have obtained. Ecologists may ask, is it sure that fishermen optimize something? If I consider these economist arguments, my answer is that when we describe the biological population using more realistic models, almost all essential economic results may change quite completely. So it has been quite easy to answer these questions, but these are the first reactions economists normally give. Then, if we consider this setup, we have, let's say, a new field of research. It can be called dynamics and control of structured population. And I find this very fascinating. It's a common field in economics, demography, mathematical biology, epidemiology, applied mathematics, and medicine. So in all these fields, a little bit similar structures, mathematical methods and models are used, and it's fascinating. So economists may study vintage capital models, optimal harvesting of sites and age structured populations, fishery-induced evolution, optimal control of AIDS, for example, or optimal control related to AIDS, and optimal control in cancer, chemotherapy, for example. So all these fields have interesting similarities. Okay, but there are still a lot of problems. My first example comes from forestry. So we can ask why ecologists may include social science aspects in their studies. Of course, we can also ask why economists may include ecological aspects in their studies. Okay, scientists may have purely instrumental motives or non-instrumental motives. Then we can ask how ecologists can include social dimensions in their studies. One possibility is work closely with stakeholders and end users. Another possibility is extend ecological concepts to cover some social dimensions. And third possibility is work closely with social scientists. I think all these are in use nowadays. If I consider forest scientists, I feel that they have traditionally applied these first two strategies. That I find very, very problematic. So what's the outcome in forest sciences? Many features represent, in forest sciences and policy, they represent very strange economics. So it's not in line with the economics I'm aware of. Second, forest sciences and policy have been strongly devoted to maximum sustainable yield idea. I already show you when I consider this dynamic pool model. So if we take this maximum sustainable yield idea, forest management becomes an objective ecological technical fact. There is no room to any values or something. It's simply ecological technical fact. So this happens to favor the strongest interest group, that is industry, and the forestry profession itself. And here I see quite serious moral hazard problem. Then very many interesting questions like uneven age management. They are difficult to study because of the narrow orientation of production ecology research in forestry. So production ecologists, they have oriented in line with these ideas, and it's even from the point of view of ecology, it's very restrictive. And it makes my life as a forest economist quite difficult because their models are too restrictive. And fourth, some production ecologists have find it quite inconvenient that economists may use their models in interdisciplinary work and then argue against the maximum sustainable yield type of results earlier presented by production ecologists. So in a sense, I partly understand why this is inconvenient, but however, I would like to point out that source codes of the models should not be made secret. That is now part of the situation that some production ecologists have made their source codes secret so that economists cannot use them anymore. It's quite amazing situation. Okay, second problem I have found is this book, or one section in that book, it's section on harvest management. This is perhaps the leading ecological textbook in the globe. So the authors first introduced maximum sustainable yield, its popularity, and some biological or exploitation risks. The authors, they admit that these resource use questions or resource exploitation questions, they cannot be studied only as ecological questions. Also social sciences and economics, or economics as a part of social sciences, must be taken into account. Okay, they first introduced economic model by Gordon. It's a very famous model in economics, but they refer to two ecologists. My comment is that the main message, economic message of the model is neglected. What's the main economic message? It is that in open access situation, fish population becomes overexploited, and that's in a sense the main economic explanation why natural resources are overexploited. They are overexploited if we have open access, no government control, no private ownership. Then some ecologically favorable results that can be obtained from this model, they remain unclear. What are these? The other main message of this model is that economically optimal population size is typically higher than, or in this model is higher than maximum sustainable yield population size. So that remains unclear. Next, they introduce discounting. They explain that if the discount rate is 10% per annum, 90 fish now are as valuable as 100 fish in 1 year's time. My comment is that if interest rate is 10%, 90 fish now is 99 fish, not 100 fish in 1 year's time. Okay, next they argue that economists are not able to use discounting and interest rate correctly. So they write that commonly used discount rate is 10%, although after inflation it should be only between 2 and 5%. Then they explain that economists' justification for this is risk, and they write that for economists a bird in the hand is worth 2 in bush. I don't find this too nice. I feel that, or I think that many ecological students are environmental friendly people, and if this is the way how economics and economists are described, it's not nice. Okay, my comment is, another comment is that risk does not, as a general rule, work in a similar way as increased discount rate. So this is very strong oversimplification. And the overall explanation of risk in fishery economic models by this phrase is, it does not make sense. So there is quite serious misunderstanding here. Then they write that economic reasoning more or less neglects the facts that fish in the water can grow and reproduce. Thus, economics, it leads to wrong investment decisions. Okay, my comment is that growth of fish and growth of fish populations, of course, included in fishery economic models, even in those models that does not represent good interdisciplinary science. Finally, different all, they write that if the discount rate is high compared to population productivity, it makes economic sense to liquidate the whole biological population. Their conclusion is that this is ecologically disdainful way of treating the hungry mouths of the future. And then they continue that new economics must be created that takes into account the jobs lost, the alternative sources of food must be found, and that there are other values than in addition of commercial values normally taken into account in economics. Okay, my comment is that, okay, let's consider this stock liquidation that is closely related to discounting you mentioned in your talk. This idea, stock liquidation, is first discovered by a mathematician, economist, biologist Olli, 1973 in Science. He presented the idea as a descriptive idea. And this is how he concludes his paper. So if you read that, it's quite clear that the message is that privatization of biological or renewable resources may not save them from extinction. So please do not kill the messenger. That's a very useful message to know. Don't kill the messenger. So it's not in a sense originally given as a normative idea. It's a warning. Privatization may not work. With biological resources, interest rate is too high. It's very useful information. Okay, as a normative idea, the stock liquidation makes economic sense only if the given population does not have any other values besides raw material. Okay, I guess some ecologists may argue that such population does not exist. Okay, that's another question. But as such, this stock liquidation idea does not necessarily represent short-sightedness at all. It's a capital allocation issue. So, is this section in Mikko et al., is it harmless or not? I feel it's not harmless because it's not an exception. It crystallizes quite common view. It was 1 year ago, in Finland, these authors published a book titled Interdisciplinary Environmental Research. It's in Finnish. And that book includes section economics. And there it's written that economists are not able to see far. Serious problem in environmental protection. So that's another similar type of understanding. So my comment to that is that when we study natural resources, we apply infinitely long time horizon. So that this claim does not make sense at all. Okay, if we go back here, I feel that when students have read Mikko et al., they may become quite suspicious. It may be better to keep distance with economics and concepts like profit and discounting. And perhaps use ecological concepts instead. So this is not good from the interdisciplinary point of view. So Stevens and his colleagues, they are ecologists, they have written that one reason why this interdisciplinary idea is proceeding quite slowly is the basic lack of trust. So I think that Mikko et al. Is doing quite bad job in this sense. So around the globe, the section may have significant influence on students' basic lack of trust and willingness to collaborate with economists. So, by the way, when ecologists collaborate with social scientists, it's usually economists that they choose, according to some papers I gave. So, my conclusions, two conclusions. First, what are behind these problems? I think one issue that is behind this problem is that in economics, values are based on human preferences. And this typically leads to trade-offs and substitutability, although the economic approach allows something to have infinite value and no substitution possibilities. We can take that into account even in our basic models. But ecologists, they sometimes take very different ethical approach, and this may be one explanation behind the basic lack of trust, different type of ethical approaches. However, it should be noted that in the practical policy context, the difference between the approaches may remain quite small if we take these ideas into account that can be included in basic economic models. Next, we can ask how scientists in different disciplines motivate their students and themselves. I think the business as usual strategy in economics, ecology and physics, for example, is as follows. First, make students and yourself perhaps believe that the discipline they and you have chosen is absolutely superior compared to neighboring disciplines. Then apply strawman arguments to eliminate neighboring things. I think that's the business as usual strategy. What's the alternative strategy? Yet to be discovered. If anyone has suggestions, it will be very interesting to hear. So, to some extent, I think this is strategy of the commons or prisoner's dilemma type of problem. So, scientists, both in ecology and economics, they should know how to solve this type of problems.
Anyway, very interesting. Thank you so much. But I think now it's only fair to give the two of you the chance to respond to one another. If there is any remaining issue that bothers you, either of you, about what the other said, maybe you want to challenge what Olli said, maybe Olli wants to challenge what Mikko said, whatever. We could use a few minutes on that and then give the floor to the audience.
First of all, I probably should say that I'm not that...
Might be a good idea, by the way, for both of you to come to the front.
I didn't want to follow the strategy that Olli was saying, that I first of all think that ecology is the superior science, and then I used these strawman arguments to shut down economists. That wasn't my purpose. My purpose was to some extent be provocative and provoke some discussions. That's why I was so sometimes perhaps harsher than I think in reality. But to some extent I tend to agree, particularly with the solutions that Olli came up with. We should work in closer contact with social scientists, particularly if we are studying questions like related to natural resource use, because natural resource problems and questions cannot be solved, I think, based on economic or ecological analysis alone. We need collaboration, definitely.
I guess one of your main concern was discounting and the question how we can take the future generations in economics into account, and that's of course one very common argument against economics in this context, and I guess in many other contexts. But the fact is that if we take the, let's say, basic economic model for optimal economic growth. It's neoclassical. So the troll is now here. It's the neoclassical model for optimal economic growth. It's published, I guess, 1928 by Frank Ramsey. He was very interesting figure. He was the friend of Wittgenstein, Keynes, and Bernard Russell. He was, in a sense, the first translator of Wittgenstein Tractatus from German to English. So he was working in Cambridge, UK. Okay, he presented the first neoclassical optimal growth model, and in that model it's still completely valid and used in economics. And in that model it's very easy to take all future generations equally. So all generations can be taken equally in that model, but still we may have discounting. For example, 4%. Why is that? The reason is that if rate of return to capital investments is possible, then €1 now is more valuable than €1 10 years from now because of capital productivity and positive rate of return. Another explanation is that if the prediction is that future generations are better off compared to us, then it's sensible to give lower weight to extra consumption in the future compared to extra consumption now. So even the basic old framework takes all generations equally, but still we have discounting. However, the fact is that, let's say, during the last 10 years, economists, they have worked a lot with this issue because of climate change. And now it's perhaps more clearly explained than earlier that in economic models, the interest rate may go down over time. So if it's now 4%, it may be 1% after 100 years. And this makes big difference in climate change context and also in biodiversity context. And what sounds very surprising perhaps is that it's fully possible that interest rate may be negative. So in that case, we put higher weight to welfare of future generations or consumption in some future moment compared to present moment. And that may happen, for example, if let's say, environmental quality goes down and consumption goes down. So the dynamic economic reasoning is much more general than normally understood, and that's in a sense this type of theoretical discussion it's very common now in economic journals, and I think these interpretations should answer that question.
So basically you're saying that this resilience concept is already taken into account in economic analysis.
Okay, I think this resilience concept is a little bit different. The resilience concept, if I understand it correctly, the situation is such that I guess this is the way how it's often described. We have this type of situation. We have this is a ball here, and if we push the ball a little bit, it comes back if we don't push it too hard. But if we push it too hard, it goes here. It goes here, and now when it's here, it's very hard to get it back here. And if this is, let's say, speaking environmental quality, then this is good environmental quality here, this is bad environmental quality here, and if our emission level, for example, or over-exploitation of the fish population is too high, then we may get here. And okay, the question is, can we take this into account in economics? The answer is yes. There are, let's say, 50 papers published on this. At least 50 papers have been published. I studied this myself 20 years ago, and it's very interesting issue, but it can be taken into account at the scientific level, okay, the practice, environmental policy practice is of course totally different question.
I think this last point is extremely important, and it occurred to me earlier too, that what you find in textbooks, what you find in economics education, what you find in policy applications might be entirely different from what you find on the front line of inquiry. Avant-gardist work done by some inventive, innovative scholars or scientists. I think there's a major difference here, and when we're making these claims about what this discipline is all about, etc., disciplinary conventions, prevailing convictions and all that, you need to make this distinction between the front line of inquiry on the one hand and the main body of research and applications on the other hand. And I think there might be some conflation between these two also in something that we heard.
That's my interpretation as well, that the conflict is not between ecology and economics, it is between how people and politicians and decision makers apply and perceive these two sciences. Okay. Or do you agree?
Yes, I guess that's quite correct.
Let me add a historical dimension here to this, because I think it's rather interesting. Mikko started out with citing Ernst Haeckel. 1870, ecology deals with the economy of nature, total relations of the animal to its inorganic and organic environment. And then you proceeded to cite Lionel Robbins in 1932-35, this idea of economics being about being the study of the allocation of scarce resources between competing ends in a market context. Now there is a difference of 60 years between these two, and actually economics had changed quite dramatically in between. So you don't have the same economics in 1870 and in the 1930s. So you can't really compare ecology and economics as if economics were a constant, historical constant. Actually, the 19th century economics was far more systems science, something that it actually might be close to the aspirations of ecology, than was the Robbinsian depiction of economics, which was far more individualistic in its outlook, and a sort of the market played a major role in this image of economics. So this is another, the historical dimension is also very important when we talk about what this or that discipline is all about.
But isn't it interesting that Haeckel's definition already included economics?
Maybe for wrong reason. I mean, he didn't really mean economics in our sense.
Yeah. But there's another thing that, I mean, the list of these similarities and parallels and also interactions between ecology and economics that Olli provided, very, very interesting and nice and exciting. But this created in my mind a kind of thought experiment, speculation of how these two disciplines might have evolved had they evolved independent from one another, in a total ignorance of what happened in the other discipline. Will they still be similar in those ways? I'm not in favor of a sort of disciplinary insularity in general, but yet this might be an interesting thought experiment, especially when thinking of what kind of evidence we find in these parallels regarding these two domains and how to appropriately study the two domains, the human economy and then the ecology. The similarities just by themselves don't show much yet.
I guess in that case of game theory, the interaction and how ideas have been transferred between the disciplines, that's, I guess it's known very well because it's quite recent, about 70 years old development or less, so that's known quite well. But it comes, for example, to optimal working theory from the economic point of view, it looks just as an economic simple or not so simple like economic optimization model. But I'm not fully aware how ecologists discovered or developed that theory. Did they have economics in their mind, or did they just discover similar structure themselves? I don't know it so well.
I would say that optimality as such is not an economic or ecological term, it's more general than that. So there's a common background.
Yeah. One implication of that is that mathematics is very important science, let's say, between these fields, or a very important common method that often makes cooperation easier than optimization is in a sense accepted in both fields, then it's quite easy to cooperate.
Okay, let's listen to the audience. The floor is yours for comments, questions.
Well, a couple of comments. I start with a small point about the similarities. Olli, you had on your slide, you had the contrast between, not the contrast, but the parallel between human overexploitation of resources and then a virus overexploiting a bacterium, which I object. I don't see that as a meaningful concept or notion. And the solution then to that seeming problem is insulation, which again is not a solution to any biologically meaningful problem. There simply is no, as far as I can see, any overexploitation in non-human nature. I agree with everybody that I don't think there is any conflict between the disciplines of economics and ecology. I think the conflict which we are thinking, or at least most people are thinking, is between how the world is run economically by the stakeholders and states and such, and how then those interest groups, which may include ecologists who are concerned about the use of natural resources, how they think the world is run badly. Take a recent example of Arctic oil drilling. There clearly is an issue here of whether we are thinking of the short-term, economic benefits for a nation like Finland if we are engaged in Arctic oil drilling versus then the predicted long-term problems which are caused by worsening climate change due to these activities. But again here I don't think it's really a conflict between how the economies are run and how we consider or to think about the use of natural resources. Take an example, for instance, preventive healthcare or poverty reduction in our society. It would probably make good economic sense to do that. But it's only that you need to have some sort of discount rate which is not applied at the present time to make sort of to have a policy which would be, as far as I can see, would be economically sensible in the long term. And I have a question to Olli about this negative interest rate. I just wonder, I mean, it's an interesting issue, and in some sense, maybe that would be the solution. But what really would happen if negative interest rate would be adapted by not only academic economists, but world leaders? It's the kind of principle.
Answer. Okay, it's an interesting question. If my bank told me that interest rate is negative, I will take very, very big loan immediately, because I don't have to pay it back totally. So it cannot be any economic equilibrium in the long run, at least. But what will happen? I guess the idea is that if the prediction is such that capital productivity or rate of return and investments will go down, and if environmental quality in the future will go down, then if we do the economic optimization exercise, the interpretation is that in the long run interest rate may be negative, and then we put higher weight to future, to extra consumption or extra environmental quality in the future compared to the weight now. That's the implication. So we must invest a lot to environmental production and perhaps decrease our consumption level. That's the implication.
Yeah, well, I mean, would market economy kind of survive as we know it?
No. This is what government should do. Market economy don't take into account of environmental problems. We need government that corrects the tragedy of the commons. That's completely clear, and I guess almost all economists must accept that nowadays. But I may answer this viruses overexploiting bacteria question. I took the figures and the idea from a paper by Hanna Kokko, and if I understood correctly, the idea is that, for example, in this figure, those viruses, they are exploiting the bacteria too fast. It's too fast if we consider their, let's say, gain, their common gain. From the point of view of their common gain, they exploit it too fast. And that's the tragedy of the commons, just similar tragedy we have in the original Hardin paper from 1968. So that's how Hanna Kokko explains, she's an ecologist, very well-known ecologist. That's how he explained tragedy of the commons within non-humans. And according to Hanna Kokko, insects like ants and bees, they use punishment. They punish free riders, so that free riders act for the common good, not selfishly. That's the story by Hanna Kokko. I found it very, very interesting, but I'm just an economist.
So basically, the idea of negative interest rate is fairly well developed in economics, but are you arguing that it's political decision to apply different interest rates to environmental goods than to, let's say, monetary stocks that you have?
Yes, if we are discussing about problems like climate change and biodiversity, then markets don't work. That's the basic economic result from 1920s by Mikko, another economist from Cambridge. Market cannot be trusted here, and government should apply environmental policy and pollution taxes or marketable emission permits or this type of measures, and when they then decide the level of emission taxes, they should take into account long-term effects. And if the prediction is that consumption will go down and rate of return on capital will go down, then they should, from the economic point of view, apply negative interest rate. That's very recent. I don't know whether it's new result, but it's a little bit new interpretation, and it has been published in, let's say, the one main theoretical journal in economics. This is mainstream, really mainstream journal of economic theory. It was published in that journal, and it's very mainstream understanding.
To me, that seems to suggest that the critics towards this ecosystem service valuation is valid then. We cannot solve the problem of ecosystem functioning and biodiversity maintenance by markets only. We need political decision, we need political incentives.
Yes, of course.
It's not, the economic analysis is not the solution.
You now, your interpretation in economic analysis is now very narrow. Economics is much wider than only markets and market values, so it's too narrow. We have public goods, it's a very old idea, number of the resources and so on. So that's very, I guess, quite typical argument or understanding that economics considers only market goods. That's not at all suitable.
This actually relates to the earlier issue that we briefly discussed, namely what exactly do we find in a discipline such as economics, and what represents this discipline better than some other things. The discipline probably contains a huge array of theoretical resources, possibilities for further inquiry, possibilities for creating new models, etc. And most of those resources, or much of those resources, are never implemented in that way. Only part of those resources are actually applied and put forward in that way. And then what determines the actual implementations of those resources, their actualizations, is then a matter of various kinds of academic institutional forces, but also extra-academic political institutional forces and all that. And then it doesn't necessarily matter much if you find, even in a leading journal, a mathematical article or a few of those that are exploiting those theoretical resources in ways that are very different from what is expected, for instance, by policymakers from this discipline. And this actually brings us to another question, namely how ecology and economics are institutionally positioned in regard to policy and policy making. I think economics is so much closer. It has a privileged position in speaking to policymakers compared to ecologists. And I think this might have very, very interesting consequences and also a possibility for those political expectations to have a shaping effect on how those vast theoretical resources in economics are actually implemented in academic economics. But we have a question.
I just want to respond to what Mikko said. Isn't it though that in a functional democracy, the political response is in a way our response to the salience of the issue? So we are electing the people who are making political decisions, and we are electing the people who prioritize economics over environmental concerns. I mean, theoretically, I mean, it's very general, but I mean, if you then want to change that or improve the environmental position, isn't it our responsibility then to forward that sort of an agenda? I mean, as a people within this democratic society. So I guess I just didn't understand why it would be placed on the politicians to kind of forward this agenda. We need to create political salience, or the salience needs to be improved amongst people who are elected to the coalition.
Most voters are completely uninformed about these matters at all.
Yes.
They play a role in the decision making in votes, casting their votes. But Katarina has a question.
Yeah, I want to push a bit on the difference between economics and ecology. It seems that now we are coming to, okay, but then they're not so different, it's just how people receive them or listen to them. But I'm not 100% convinced. And one of the ways in which I'd like you to push is in this example of resilience. And so you were saying resilience is important in ecology, but it's not like a tool or a concept that's so much important in economics. And then Olli said, oh no, but isn't that resilience? And he drew that graph on the blackboard. But I would think that the difference is, if there is a difference, I'm not sure, I don't know, and that's what I would like you to tell me, is what economists take to be the important factors that determine the resilience of an ecosystem vis-a-vis what ecologists take to be the important factors that determine the resilience of an ecological system. And yeah, the reason being is that maybe there are things that are like superficially similar, but then, I mean, at a closer look, there might be differences in what are, for instance, the causal relationships that are theorized in one discipline rather than another. So the fact that there are similar concepts and similar mathematical structures or what have you doesn't make it very close to one another, or at least. Yeah. So it's a question to both of you, because I don't know what each of the disciplines take to be, for instance, the reasons, what lies behind resilience.
Well, speaking about this resilience and the definition of resilience, I don't think there are two separate definitions of it. And your question was, are there differences in factors that might be important for resilience? If we talk about resilience of the ecosystem, I don't think that the factors can be different in different. Ecosystem is resilient because certain rules apply or certain conditions apply. And I don't think that those factors or drivers differ, whether you look at those things from different angles. They are kind of a natural science part of it.
So the reason why you didn't know about the articles about the resilience is just that they don't travel.
Perhaps that's just my
interdisciplinary.
ignorance. I'm not that familiar of the economic literature on resilience.
Sorry.
Okay, one let's say policy type of concept ecologists often use in this context is the precautionary principle. And in economics we may not have, at least in mainstream economics, we may not use that word, but we use the word option value. And according to some authors in this area, these two concepts are, let's say, practically very similar. So precautionary principle in ecology, or actually applied ecology and option value in economics, they lead to similar policy instructions. That's also quite interesting. But I would like to mention one issue that may make difference. It's a little bit related to this resilience issue. It's a question on values and how we get values to our, say, models or our thinking. There is some kind of resilience society somewhere, and they strongly oppose economics. And I guess the reason is that they don't accept the, let's say, ethical principles we apply in mainstream economics. It's utilitarianism that we are applying, and they don't accept that. They would like to apply different type of ethical approach. And in your slides you also mentioned that ecology is non-anthropogenic, and economics is anthropogenic. In economics, all values, they come from the preferences of consumers or citizens, and that's the origin of all preferences. And I felt that in your presentation you, in a sense, questioned that a couple of times. Is this correct understanding?
Yes, and I think that's more philosophical question than just related to ecology versus economics.
I think that's one very important, let's say, reason why economists and ecologists disagree in different ethical understanding and principles.
I would think that's really a major issue in this idea of preference-based valuation. That can be easily disputed and should be disputed, and it should be an issue also in a wider interdisciplinary conversation. We are short of time, but there are two more people wishing to comment, and if you want to make a comment, please make it short. Janne, you hoping it would be first.
Okay, thanks. It's short. You may comment on this, but I understand that it's interesting to listen to Olli and the comments that there's, my interpretation is that the power structures today are basically presenting a distorted or a one-sided view of the broad field that is economics, and that's kind of interesting. And particularly in light of the recent developments, for example, in biodiversity conservation, there's a movement going on where we're establishing an international panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and within it there's an explicit effort to integrate scientific advice of ecology into the decision-making structure. And I'd just like to hear your speculation about which distorted version of ecology shall we see in the politics of ecosystems in the future. I'm sort of jumping out, I'm sort of assuming that if the process is the same as in economics, that we'll choose one particular version of economics that dominates decision making. Are there elements in ecology that might be particularly alluring?
Yeah, well, if we take very narrow approach to ecosystem services and only look at the values and as they are defined now, the kind of current values from ecosystem services, that will definitely lead to a situation where we put into risk large part of biodiversity, because only, as I said, only part of the species are valuable at the moment, and so perhaps 90% of the species can go if we take that very narrow economic valuation approach to ecosystem services. That's perhaps the largest risk I see.
My comment is still related. I'm thinking that, well, when economics is applied in societal decision making concerning natural things, it's usually in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And then Mönkönen's criticism seems to be that, okay, this analysis only takes into account the kinds of species that matter for individual people. And only they are valued, but there is no consideration given to sustainability or biodiversity as such. And therefore, at least what I have seen is that ecologists have mainly criticized the whole method and sort of tried to dump it all together and say we shouldn't look at those cost-benefit analysis at all because it's fundamentally wrong from the very beginning. Now, well, as I see it, you can do two things. You can continue this line, or you can go and influence the economists such that they would tune their cost-benefit analysis a bit.
May I answer or comment? Okay, economists, they are not so silly after all. If ecologists can show that all these species are somehow essential from the point of view of sustainability, of course, cost-benefit analysis or economics must take that into account. It's self-evident. Of course, some citizens may not understand it, but the idea is that when economists get the values from citizens, those citizens are well informed. Otherwise, it's nonsense to take their values seriously. They must be well informed.
They are not.
And if ecologists can show that these species are essential, although we don't see just now in what sense and why, but if they can give good arguments, it must be taken into account in cost-benefit analysis and economics. Otherwise, it's nonsense cost-benefit analysis. It's in a sense self-evident.
Yeah, I would say along the same lines that cost-benefit analysis, the problem with the cost-benefit analysis is that at the moment we are not probably able to measure benefits to their full extent.
Okay, then in economics we take into account the option value of these species, and you argue that we should apply pre-cost principle. It's more or less same. But okay, I would still like to repeat the idea that one problem with ecology and economics is this value question, philosophical value question. I'm not expert in that area, but according to my understanding, that's one question we can perhaps not settle immediately. It's very difficult.
I would say that the conflict is between economic approach and how economists tend to deal with so-called intrinsic value. Value that people are able to give things, environment, regardless of the economic value. That's perhaps the divide, not between ecology and economics. How to deal with intrinsic value. If there's nobody to give that value, do we still have value? No humans to give that value. Do those values exist or not?
Well, as we all see, this is an all too big set of issues for an hour and a half or even a bit more. And I think the conclusion is that not only to thank the two speakers for very nice insights, but also that we will organize follow-up sessions on these related issues in the future. Thanks also to the audience.